It's very unique to have brothers on one team, but two twins? You don't hear that. Both Daniel and Henrik are very special players.
I think the Sedins, in some ways, they did change the way the game was played.
They didn't have to say much. They led by example, and if you want to be successful, you just have to follow them.
Oh, what a shot! A give and go from the Twins!
They were role models in the way they played and carried themselves on and off the ice. Me and my brother for sure looked at them, dreaming of one day to get to play together in the NHL.
Every time I put on the jersey, every time I look at my sweater and I see the C on it, I definitely feel the presence.
Daniel and Henrik were incredible athletes, but what they've done off the ice is just as important.
Just hearing about the donation they gave to BC Hospital, that speaks for itself. Just the type of people they are and how they want to give back to the community.
When loved ones are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, families go through the hardest times of their lives.
You are forced to try to make the most of the time you have left. People like Henrik and Daniel come and visit. It's like you won the lottery.
Our daughter, her favorite player was Daniel, and when he came to visit her, the reaction that Tessa had is a moment that just stays with us forever.
It just felt like you were a little less alone in a really dark time.
They developed the sense that when you have success, it's important to give back.
That makes me a bit emotional. They inspired these new guys, and so it's like they're still there. We still see their example through the players that are there now.
No, folks around Canada, it is not rain that we're feeling in Vancouver. It's a bit of tears, as this is a week that the legends have returned, and it is the week that Henrik and Daniel Sedins, number 22 and number 33, will be retired and rise above the Rogers Arena rafters and will be remembered forever. Welcome to a special edition of the Hockey Podcast. My name is Kevin Olenek. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_hockey. Like us on Facebook, the Hockey Podcast, and subscribe. You can subscribe on Google Podcasts. You can subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And I have with us today is Tyler. Hello, Tyler.
Hey, Kevin.
And are you in Terrace all prepared for the ceremony of the Sedins?
Absolutely. I have plans to have a few people over tomorrow night and be able to enjoy the festivities as a group and look forward to a great game between the Canucks and Blackhawks afterwards.
Yes, it'll be very fun. Sean is with us. Hello, Sean.
Hello.
How are things over there?
It's good. It's good. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Last night was a good kickoff for Sedin Week with a nice thumping of Nashville, and hopefully we get to see another nice win tomorrow to celebrate the Sedins.
Yes, it will be very, very good. And also with us is Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hi there.
Hi. Chris is drinking his Stein that he won at the Pig and Duke fundraiser, and I believe are you rubbing it in on everybody that you have this Stein that you're drinking right now?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say rubbing it in. I was just simply, showing it to you guys, but it wasn't meant as a brag or anything.
I'm I'm trying to create podcast tension, and you're not helping. It's okay.
You chose the wrong person. I'm very anti-confrontation.
I understand. It's okay.
And it drives me nuts.
I was going to say, if you want attention, all you have to do is just put Sean and Chris together.
There we go. Yes.
Yeah, that was the ingredient we were missing.
Yes. Well, we started this with the Budweiser tribute to Henrik and Daniel Sedin, and I want to read this tweet from Jillian Fisher and where we're going today. It's she tweeted this this morning. Think of Tuesday morning for those that are not listening later in the week. Think about the people you wouldn't have met if it wasn't for hockey. I know it isn't perfect, but there are so many great people in this community. And probably no better of an example of watching a community unite and get excited and build was the 2010-2011 Vancouver Canucks Stanley Cup run. And that's what we're going to review today. We have done our Sedin tribute. We're going to focus on what I believe was peak Vancouver Canuck time and peak Daniel Henrik Sedin time. This was when both, I believe, the Sedins became on partly bigger on the map, and this is when the Canucks became a national conversation because of their Stanley Cup run, and we'll get into that. But first, I'm going to start with Chris. Chris, Chris is our music aficionado. He's passionate about all things music. What was the music that we were enjoying back in 2010, 2011?
Well, I'm going to start off with the genre of my favorite, which is rock. So that year, we were hearing songs like Savior by Rise Against, Uprising by Muse, and I Will Not Bow by Breaking Benjamin. But as far as general pop, it was more like songs like TikTok by Kesha, Hey Soul Sister by Train, California Girls by Katy Perry, and I can go on and on and on. So that kind of gives you just a taste of what sort of music was on the scene at that point.
Right. Where were you in 2010, 2011?
I was living in Vancouver at the time, so I had the amazing opportunity of being able to live up the excitement in the city that it was happening in.
Yeah. Tyler, were you here in Vancouver?
No, I had just left. I had returned home here to Terrace in the spring of 2010, so it was my first full season back, watching with the family, living and dying through all the moments. But still certainly it was fresh in my experience, having been there for the couple of playoff appearances prior to that. And I was fortunate while a BCIT student to attend a playoff game in 2007. Actually, it was the Stars and Canucks. It was a Game 7. It was my first playoff game, and the Canucks won that one. Trevor Linden scored in that game. So coming back here, it was an exciting time to be a Canuck fan, certainly, and then get to enjoy all the great memories of that season with my family nice and close.
Fair. Yes. Chris, did you get to any games that year when you were out here?
I got to go to a couple of regular season games, but none during the playoffs. I was kind of priced out in that regard.
It was a bit expensive. Sean, where were you?
No, I was still here in Calgary.
I feel like I'm lecturing. Sean, where were you on the dates of the following?
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to be out in Vancouver during the spring a couple times in the previous years, but I was still just enjoying the run out here in Calgary with a bunch of bitter Flames fans.
I think it's going to be interesting for hear your perspective going through this from a Flame living in Calgary during that time. And one of the themes of the national conversation was the ended up black hat that the Canucks ended up wearing. But I think before we start the 2010-2011 season, I think we need to go back and talk about the 2009-2010 season briefly. That was, of course, 2010, of course, was when the Olympics were in Vancouver. I will sit on my chair that I am sitting right now, that this is, and state this as the oldest person on this podcast, and being around for 1988, that this was the best Winter Olympics ever. Sorry, Calgary, Vancouver outdid it. There was such an energy that came out. And I think in terms of, for the city's perspective, from Vancouver City's perspective, it really kind of propelled the Canucks and the city into a bit of a different frenzy, of a bit of a different excitement. But the 2009-2010 season did not end the way that it was expected. They finished third in the Western Conference, but were eliminated in 6 games from the LA Kings. So quickly looking back on 2009-2010, did you look at that as something that was wasted, a learning experience? How did you feel at the end of the 2009-2010 season?
Well, Kev, just to correct you there, it was another loss to Chicago in 6 games in the second round.
Oh, you're right. That is dumb of me. That's right. Why did I see the Kings? You're right. I was looking somewhere else. All right. Well, that was dumb. Yes, correction. So let me correct that again. It was an elimination again from the Chicago Blackhawks, which will play big into our next part of this. But looking back, the Blackhawks did it again. And how did you feel, basically? Basically, coming out of that season, coming out of feeling this nemesis from the Blackhawks, how did you feel?
Just frustrated, because it was yet again the Blackhawks who eliminated the Canucks, and it was just, what do we have to do to get past them? Is really what it was like.
Yeah, I felt the same way. You start having all these questions about the core of the team. Do they need to blow things up? What's up with Luongo? All those kinds of things. There was I believe at one point in a Chicago newspaper, there was the headline, "Buffy the Luongo Slayer," in regards to Dustin Byfuglien. So there was definitely a lot of doubts about the Canucks' capability going forward into the next season as to getting over that second round hump. It was very disappointing. I mean, in 2009, the year before, they had gotten back into the playoffs after missing the previous season, and swept St. Louis in the first round. Then they played Chicago, and it was a pretty great series, but it was just like, okay, well, we've got to try again next year. But that wasn't the feeling at the end of the 2010 playoffs. It was a lot of concern, a lot of frustration for me.
Yeah, that was the season when Chelsea Dagger really started becoming a song that was haunting not only Canucks fans, but the Canucks players as well.
Right. Yes, because that was the Blackhawks theme song. So let's look at who left in terms of free agents from that year. Ryan Johnson left, Kyle Wellwood left, Willie Mitchell left, Matt Pettinger left, Brad Lukowich left, Nathan McIver left, Andrew Raycroft left, and of course the late Pavel Demitra left for the KHL. Out of those 8 players, who do you feel the Canucks ended up missing the most?
Oh, I would say Willie Mitchell. Healthy Willie Mitchell was someone that would have made a huge difference for the Canucks in the finals. So in 2011, but he wasn't healthy at the time, though. So it's tough to say. But for me, a healthy Willie Mitchell would have been really, really, really important.
And from what I recall, Willie left on a note where, he didn't want to have to leave, but the Canucks were kind of just like, well, this isn't really working out, so we're going to send you down to L.A.
Yeah, and Kevin, I was just going to say, I mean, for me, Pavel Demitra is a close second there. I mean, he was great for Slovakia in the 2010 Olympics. He was really hitting his stride and helped. So that was one who would have been nice to have him as well.
If memory serves, wasn't Pavel Demitra the round robin MVP or something like that during the ramp up to the Olympics? Or sorry, during that part of the Olympics?
I don't recall.
But yeah, he definitely had a hell of an Olympics in Vancouver. That's for sure.
Yes, I'll type that in as we're looking here. The free agents that were acquired during that time included Darren Archibald, Peter Schaefer, Rafi Torres, Bill Sweat, Tyler Wildman, Jeff Tambellini, Dan Hamhuis, Manny Malhotra, Joel Perreault, Lee Sweat, some guy named Christopher Tanev, and Corinne's favorite player, Eddie Lack. I'll focus specifically on Torres, Hamhuis, and Malhotra. What did they, looking back, what did they bring?
Well, Hamhuis and Malhotra brought some veteran leadership, a steadying force on the defensive side, and then Rafi Torres brought chaos. It was a bowling ball on skates, like just would hit everything. But he created so much just from skating around on that forecheck and just creating havoc.
Yeah, controversial, but he was like an essential part of that team. But definitely controversial for sure.
Well, his presence was such a factor. Even, just him being out on the ice, if you're on the opposing team, it was a guy that you had to pay attention to. Like he put fear into opponents with his hitting, and the Canucks haven't had that since. And they didn't really have that in the years leading up to when Torres was part of the team. So there was that, and I would echo as well the comments about Malhotra and Hamhuis. Certainly improving the Canucks' defensive play.
Yeah. And then in terms of trades, you had the offseason acquisition of Keith Ballard for Bernier, Grabner, Michael Grabner, and a first-round pick in 2010, which turned out to be Quentin Howden. You had the Ryan Parent and Jonas Anderson for Shane O'Brien trade, Andrew Peters for Darcy Hordichuk. Now you Nathan Pash for Sean Zimmerman. Those were not big deals, but more significant deals. Chris Higgins was acquired for Evan Oberg and Cole Castles, and then Maxim Lapierre and McGregor Sharp for Joel Perreault and a third-round pick in 2012, what turned out to be Frederick Anderson. Was there a trade? This is when, let's quickly talk about Mike Gillis and looking back here, because there's always going to be, he's going to be one of two polarizing people that we're going to, possible polarizing people that we're going to talk about here. Mike Gillis being one. Some felt that he had rode the coattails of previous management and didn't do anything super significant. Others feel that what he brought, his presence, was the very reason that the Canucks were able to get to where they were. Where are you on where Mike Gillis's contributions?
Like he put the finishing touches on this team. They weren't going to get to the finals without Dan Hamhuis. They weren't going to get to the finals without Rafi Torres. They weren't going to get to the finals without the additions at the deadline of Chris Higgins and Max Lapierre. To say that, the core was there, but he also put into place a lot of behind the scenes things that allowed these players to play at the top of their level when other teams weren't. And
Sean,
that was
you didn't mention Christian Ehrhoff there either, which was a key transaction for their defense and power play, and also enabled the Canucks to offload a first-round pick from 2007 in Patrick White that turned out to not work out for the Canucks.
Yeah, but the big thing, I think that what Gillis doesn't get recognized for, and still doesn't, which is criminal in my opinion, is all the behind the scenes about travel and how to make the team do better how the team can play better on the road because of how teams travel can be tiring, and you're not necessarily playing playing your best because you're tired. So he worked hard on the science of that. He worked hard on figuring out, okay, and it was the beginning of the analytics movement really as well. So I really do think that he doesn't get the credit he deserves, which is partially, I would say, a little bit his fault just because of how he came across as. Mike Gillis is always going to be one of the smartest people in the room, but he also makes sure you know it. So I think that definitely rubbed people the wrong way. But a lot of what he did was behind the scenes. for me.
For me, if you want to look at the roster that they took into that 2010-2011 final, more of it was put into place by previous management than him. But as Sean says, the finishing touches were very key finishing touches and deals that I would have to think were not easy to pull off. And he was able to make the right moves at the right time. He handed out a lot of no trade clauses in contracts, but he got good deals on the cap hit to get that roster assembled. And keep the team competitive into the next couple of years as well, even though they didn't get as far in the playoffs. So, Mike Gillis deserves credit certainly for taking what was already a pretty good team and making it a great one.
Yeah, like buzzwords like sleep doctors and hometown discount and stuff like that are very key. What's the word I'm looking for? Phrases from the Mike Gillis era. He definitely brought like a unique outsider, like thinking outside of the box sort of strategy to your stereotypical GMs. So yeah, I think he doesn't get as much credit as he deserves, but I also do agree with Tyler and the rest where he definitely wasn't the one who built the core. He just simply finished the roster off.
Fair. Yeah, I think. Yeah, he brought a swagger to the Canucks that I don't think that I think they lost when Brian Burke left. I thought Brian Burke brought a little bit of a swagger to the Canucks organization, sort of. Of course, we will always remember the Brian Burke quote is Sedin is not Swedish for punching or headlocking. Mike Gillis brought back that swagger. And it propelled them into a sort of wearing a black hat. And a lot of the players that became well-known and folk heroes in Canuck land were players that you would consider black hats. Raffi Torres wasn't well-loved. We'll get into Ryan Kessler, Alex Burrows, Roberto Luongo, and some of how the conversation happened in the media was, I think, because of that swagger that Mike Gillis brought. And I don't think he gets specifically enough credit for bringing that back to where the Canucks were. Because when the Canucks are at Canuck peak, there is that certain, that explicit warning here. There's that certain fuck you that they have for everyone else in the NHL. I think that's when Canucks are at their peak. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and I think that's sort of where I think a lot of teams are at, though, Kev. I think when they have that swagger, they have that confidence, they have that ability to turn it on and just say, okay, we're winning this game. You look at St. Louis this past year. Once they got on the roll and going into the playoffs, they were like, okay, yeah, we're going to win this game. And in 2010-2011, the Canucks had that. They could definitely turn it on at a single moment during the game and just take over a game.
Yeah, but I also think too, just there was a certain. The Blues were a bit more lovable in comparison because you had the Gloria song. You sort of had this sort of, it was like they were playing the Boston Bruins, and we'll get to the Bruins a little bit here too, but obviously in terms of the themes, but there was a sort of, we're cheering for the Blues. The Canucks were not necessarily a team that Canada was getting behind or the NHL was getting behind. It had an us versus them kind of feel.
Maybe a more apt comparison would be like last year's Tampa Bay Lightning regular season team.
Right. Yeah, fair.
Well, I think part of what Kevin's getting at, though, has to do with the characters on the Canucks more than Gillis, in my opinion. Like, Gillis had that swagger, too, but then you also had Kessler and Burrows, who weren't afraid to get into the dirty areas and play dirty, and then you added Raffi Torres, who always was always in the middle of it, too, and wasn't afraid to push the edge on a hit. I think that was part of it for sure. Then they added Lapierre too, right? And that's someone who has a face that you want to punch.
Fair. And there is a person that I don't think gets enough credit in this market for what he brought, and that was Alain Vigneault. It's fair to say that Alex Burrows saved Alain Vigneault, of course, and when he scored that goal against Carolina, his position was tenuous at that time. But I don't know where we rank him in terms of Canuck coaches. I'll leave that to you. But he sort of brought an additional swagger to the team with sort of how he treated the media. And, I think he's one of the, no offense to Travis Green here at all, but I think that he was missed for a few years here, I think is fair to say. I don't know if Alain Vigneault has gotten truly the recognition for what he brought to this franchise.
Well, he did win a Jack Adams Award, so there is that. That was from the 06-07 season. I like how you touched on it, though, Kevin, in regards to AV and the media. I thought he did a wonderful job of managing the media, which is a very difficult job to do, coaching one of the Canadian franchises. I don't think AV will ever get enough credit for that specifically. I wanted to actually mention here, too, we talked about moves that Gillis made. I actually think one of the things he deserves some credit for was a move that he didn't make, and that was changing the coach that he inherited from the previous management group,
which was Vigneault.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I remember when Gillis was hired, and there was about a 2-3 week stretch there where Vigneault's his job was on the line, and they weren't sure if he was coming back. And Gillis sat down and talked with him and met and listened to what he thought. Listened to Vigneault's thoughts and told him, this is what the type of team I want to put together. Can you coach that? And to Vigneault's credit, he said, yeah, totally. I can definitely do that. And then proved to Gillis that he could. And as Tyler said, I think definitely in terms of how he dealt with the media in a very intense Canadian market, I think is something that he'll never get enough credit for, because it was really hard to handle that media at times, and I think he did it really, really well.
And he still looked like he was having a lot of fun throughout his time as the Canucks coach as well. He's an affable coach. When it was time to get serious and keep the answers short, he did that. But he wasn't afraid to let his guard down once in a while and be like a normal human being, which often you don't see with coaches. It's all serious all the time.
Maybe it was just due to how successful that era was, but I don't think I've ever seen a coach have as much fun as AV did during that era. Like, he was always smirking. He was always smiling. He laughed more than any other coach I've ever seen at the NHL level.
Yeah.
When Travis Green's laughing, it's usually mocking the officials, and that's the only time you ever see him laugh, right? But AV seemed to really enjoy, being in that role.
Yeah. Where were you on Henrik and Daniel Sedin at this point in time? Coming into the 2010-2011 season, what was your perceptions of them? What were your expectations of them going into this season?
Well, they were two of the best players in the league. Like, it was pretty obvious that they were in their prime. They were making plays that were unbelievable. You couldn't, they could take over a shift, a game, period, with just once they got the puck into the offensive zone and started the Sedin cycle. I felt that they, especially living in Calgary, I felt that they were very much wrongly labeled because a lot of it was jealousy of the success that the Canucks were having, plus being a geographic rival. But they were constantly insulted and called very derogatory names based off of just the them continuing to score on the Flames and Oilers because they were just that damn good. So I loved watching them just work the puck down low and find just keep finding ways to surprise me with what they could do.
And just before we continue, I want to just make this point. I do think that many NHL fan bases and a lot of NHL owe the Sedins an apology for that kind of derogatory comments, because Ryan Kessler talked about, and even Brian Burke talked about, that their toughness was, we look at toughness in Canada as like bopping somebody in the head, and they were, their toughness was playing through injuries that we never knew about, and some of the stuff that they got, I think, was absolutely despicable. But anyway, continue on that. But
or even just trying to push them off the puck, like that to me was where the peak Sedin toughness was like, you try and get them off the puck, off of the wall in the corner, good luck, because it's not going to happen, especially in that season. As a Canucks fan at that era, though, like, we knew they were the real deal. We were just frustrated as a fan base at the lack of respect they were getting everywhere else in the league. And I think you guys have kind of already addressed that, but I just felt like making that specific statement.
Right.
Yeah. Kevin, you asked the question, where were we at with the Sedins going into the 2010-2011 season? Well, we're all in agreement with it. We felt they were superstar, top-level players in the league. Henrik had come off a Hart Trophy win the previous season. But there was still that question mark, can those guys get it done in the playoffs? Of course, the two previous years' exits against Chicago and the bad memories, and even though there was a lot to focus on Luongo and Dustin Byfuglien and there was other narratives there, but it's like, these are the Canucks' best players. They are the leaders of the team. When are they going to drag this team and take them to the promised land? And as it turned out in the 10-11 playoffs, they did get further.
They solved it, yes. Would it be fair to say this was peak Sedinery around this time?
Yeah, it was. You had 09-10 when Henrik won the Hart Trophy and the Art Ross, and then in 10-11 was when Daniel won the Art Ross, so, as well as the Lester B. Pearson. So, yeah, it totally was.
Yeah. And then we get to the regular season, and of course that was the President's Trophy. Anything specific within the regular season that you were like, I remember this moment of this was fun?
Honestly, not too much. I think most of the memories have been taken by the playoff run more than anything else.
For me, the memories are simply the amount of times the Canucks wiped the other Canadian teams, specifically Edmonton. And I think that's what fueled a lot of the dislike for the Canucks elsewhere in Canada, was the fact that the Canucks were having so much success against the Oilers, the Flames, the Maple Leafs. It was almost like it was a free pass every time the Canucks matched up against those teams.
If we're talking about regular season moments, the one that happened actually right at the very end, it might have been the last game of the season, actually, versus the Flames, was that Daniel Sedin between the legs goal. That Daniel did the no-look tip pass through his legs.
Yes, that did not sit well with Flames fans, but it for Canucks fans that was a great goal, and that was. My buddy Sheldon from school tweeted Matthew Tkachuk scored a goal against San Jose was sort of similar, and it was like he tweeted, "Thanks, Matthew, for the tribute to the Sedins." So, but that it may have rubbed Flame fans the wrong way, but I think from the Canucks perspective, it felt good.
And to go back to your question prior, asking about what games we'd been to that season, that was actually one of the few games that I had gone to. And my uncle had a scalper friend who got me a wicked deal, got me row one tickets for $200 a ticket. And I was about probably 40, 50 feet away from Daniel when he scored that goal. So it was definitely a game I'll never forget.
As good, unfortunately, that I'm going to have to break this up a bit because as amazing as that goal was, that was the season before, though. That was the 09-10 season. But in terms
that was 2010. Sorry, I was mistaken.
Yeah, in terms of Sedin highlights, that is definitely one of the best, though.
Okay. Well, that, good podcasting on our part that we got the wrong year, but I always think it relates in the sense that, it kind of was, part of the theme was sort of how the Vancouver Canucks were perceived in the national media going into the playoffs. And Tyler mentioned the Oilers. The Oilers finished last in the standings 2010, 2011. I'm just going through here. I believe the Oilers, this was, we were getting close to the time that the Oilers were starting to get their number one picks here. So there was that tension. Just for funsies, Edmonton was 25, 45, and 12. They had 62 points. Ottawa was the second worst Canadian team, 26th overall, 32, 40, and 10. We had Toronto 37, 34, and 11, 85 points. And Calgary did not make the playoffs, 41, 29, and 12, 94 points. Montreal made the playoffs, 44, 30, and 8, 96 points. And then there was no Winnipeg at the time, so Vancouver was miles ahead of everybody of their Canadian team. And the expectation could have been that they were going to get in to be the first Canadian team to win a Stanley Cup since the Montreal Canadiens did it. But lo and behold, who's their first round opponent? It is those damn Chicago Blackhawks. So going into that playoff series, let's start there. What were you feeling at that time? Was this?
Well, at that point, I think every Canucks fan was like, "Oh boy, here we go again."
Everyone's stomach was in their throats.
Yeah, it was like, can they find a way to break this freaking curse or whatever it was, and then they went up 3-0 in the series, and everything was great, but. Yeah, it was quite the emotional roller coaster of a series,
and it was almost not the Blackhawks that claimed the 8th seed. If I remember correctly, they needed help on the final day of the regular season and backed in and secured that playoff spot. I can't remember what the other result was that they needed, but they barely got in. So on one hand, the Canucks approached the end of the season and the fan base had a lot of swagger. It's like, okay, this is going to be a memorable playoffs. They've been building towards this, the President's Trophy, finishing way ahead of the field. But yeah, when it was Chicago, there was also quite a bit of concern there.
Yeah, sorry, I just got a message. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. We'll talk about that we'll kind of quickly touch on that at the end here, maybe. Yeah, so 3-0, and then it's 3-1, and then it's 3-2, and then it's 3-3. The Chicago Blackhawks come back from a 3-0 deficit to tie the series. This game is coming back in Vancouver, and the Canucks get the lead until late, and the Chicago Blackhawks tie it. And is it safe to say that this goal, the Alex Burrows slayed the Dragon goal, was the biggest goal in franchise history?
Yes, bar none.
Yeah, I think you might be able to make an argument for Bure in '94 versus the Flames, but in terms of, especially with this team, had they blown that 3-0 series lead, and a lead in that game as well, that team would have been blown up. They would have gone out and started from scratch. Like Burrows might have been traded, Kessler might have been traded. The fallout of losing that series would have been just insane. but they thank you, Alex Burrows, but they didn't, and we got to go on the ride, and it's definitely one of the two that you can make the argument for.
And we all know how sensationalist the Vancouver sports media can be, and I just remember they were basically saying if we don't win this game, this team is done. The coach is done. The GM is done. It's all getting blown up. So it was literally, it felt like an all or nothing sort of moment is what I specifically recall from then.
I was in local television here in Terrace at the time, and I remember specifically describing on our show that the Canucks were on the brink of the worst ever collapse in NHL history. I mean, for a President's Trophy team to come in as the number one seed with such a big lead and such big expectations, and to be up 3-0 in the series and to collapse like that would to me would have been the worst ever collapse in a 7-game playoff series that the NHL had ever seen. And if you're a believer in hockey gods, maybe they for one sided with the Canucks and said, no, it's not going to be like this tonight.
Yes. And looking back, of course, back at that, of course, the Blackhawks won 7-2 and 5-0, and then there was the overtime game that the Blackhawks won in Game 6. And then we had that. Then next was Nashville. And this was the point that the NHL was introduced to Ryan Kesler. It's fair to say that Ryan Kesler took the Vancouver Canucks on their back and pretty much willed them to victory out of this to get to the Western Conference Final with his performance. Is that am I being accurate there?
Oh, absolutely, Kevin. If it wasn't for Kessler's performance, they would have lost that series. The Predators put up a very tough, stingy 6 games in that series, and Pekka Rinne was great, Joel Ward was great, but Kesler was the best player in the series and did make the difference for the Canucks.
To say he was a man possessed doesn't even do it justice. He carried us through that series. Yeah, he was just a world beater in that series. The league knew of Ryan Kesler at that point. He'd already been nominated for the Selke Trophy a couple times, and he actually ended up winning it in this season. But in that series, he just took it over, and Nashville did not have an answer for him.
No, and he was really under their skin, too. I remember Barry Trotz, the coach at the time for the Predators, complaining, I think, about Kesler chicken winging the stick of somebody playing for the Preds and drew a penalty call. And so not only was he dominant on the ice, but he was in the heads of the opposition as well, the mark of a really great player, really great competitor.
Yeah. It was just... And the reason I say national is because I think that, there's always a regular season. We talk about this often, but playoffs bring this a different animal, and I think Kesler rose to that point in time. Other than that, was there anything else in that series that you thought was a little under the radar?
Well, I think one random thing I remember from that series was the Green Men meeting Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban.
That's right. Yes. How could we forget about the Green Men? Yes.
They seem to annoy Glenn Healy in that series too, if I remember right.
Because he was between the benches at the time.
Glenn Healy,
What's that? Sorry?
I think everything annoys Glenn Healy, though.
Yeah, I think this podcast would probably annoy Glenn Healy right now. So, yeah.
Glenn Healy hates fun.
Yes, absolutely. Shout out to Heidi there. Glenn Healy hates fun. Hopefully Heidi will make a note of that if she's listening. But, so we're on to they're on to the San Jose Sharks. It is the top 2 teams in the Western Conference. Vancouver gets out to a 2-0 lead. This is foreshadowing. And then San Jose comes back 4-3, but Vancouver takes game 4, 4-2. So it's May 24th, 2011. It is game 5, and it is a moment of history. It's tied and going into overtime. One overtime doesn't solve it, but then Kevin Bieksa bounces, takes the puck off the stanchion, bangs it in, and the Vancouver Canucks are off to the Stanley Cup. At that point, what were you feeling? Was it like, okay, we're finally here? It's like, okay, yes, we won, we're here. Was it, yes, we've got the Stanley Cup? What was the feeling at that point in time?
It was just pure euphoria at that point, because you felt like there was something special with this team, and you weren't sure, but you were really, really hoping that it would have been it was the year. So I remember watching that goal, and just I don't think I could sit down for at least an hour. I was that pumped up.
I mean, for me, it was such a weird goal that I was just in shock initially. That you'd see the crowd celebrating, and you hear Jim Houston describing the moment, and I'm just, my initial reaction was, what the heck happened? Like, I'm looking for a replay, looking for answers, and then it set in. It's like, wow, they actually are back in the Stanley Cup final, and didn't know who the opponent was at that immediate moment, so it was hard to really sort of immediately size up their chances, but it was just like a bit of another chance to take a deep breath, and another check mark in terms of rounds completed, and here we go. It was a mixture of excitement and nervousness, and the big stage is upon us.
Who did you prefer to play? Did you want the Boston Bruins, or did you want the Tampa Bay Lightning?
I was hoping for Tampa.
Did you?
Yeah, I was definitely hoping for Tampa too.
Did you feel that was an easier challenge?
I felt like they just matched up better in the sense that they were both scoring teams, whereas the physical intimidation of Boston was what worried me, and obviously history proved me right in that regard.
The way that Montreal had trouble with Boston after coming out to a 2-0 series lead there in the first round, the way Tim Thomas was playing, I think he had one or two bad games in the third round against Tampa Bay, but it didn't have a good feeling about playing in Boston. And in terms of style of play, it felt like the Canucks would have matched up against Tampa Bay, but that was a lesson for me at the time about be careful what you wish for, right? Like, you just never know. There was some thoughts about who the Canucks would rather play in the third round as well. So at the end of the day, it's your team that has to perform well and get it done.
And I just want to go back a half step, just because Kev brought up this question about Boston before I was able to jump in about my experience with Bieksa's goal.
Oh, yeah,
I was actually outside of the CBC studios watching it on their outdoor screen with probably about like 2,000 other people. And I remember seeing myself on the broadcast when they showed like the crowd shots, and just the amount of insane jubilation, like happiness, euphoria that people were experiencing on the street there was something I'd never, I want to say had never experienced before, but now thinking back to it, 2010 was just the year prior, so I definitely had experienced something similar, but nothing in terms of with the Canucks. So it was just like a, holy shit, this is actually happening. We're going to the Stanley Cup final sort of excitement. Because I grew up becoming a Canucks fan because of the 94 run, but for me, this was like my first experience of like, holy shit, I get to experience the Stanley Cup final and actually be able to consciously remember it.
So let's before we get into the Stanley Cup final here, which it's an old ball of wax here in terms of historic. Would it be fair to say that the run would you say, Chris, it was more of a civic pride as opposed to 2010 Olympics, more of a national pride thing, or was there a bit of civic pride blended into what was happening in Vancouver, or how do you see the difference?
Well, like for me, like 2010, like you knew that everyone was on the same team. Like everyone was cheering on Canada. Everyone, like there wasn't any sort of like conflicting fandom in the city of Vancouver. Like obviously there was, visiting countries that were there, but as far as your experience day to day on the street, you were high-fiving Canadians, you were singing Canada, you were just having a great time during the Olympics. Whereas, as everyone knows, in the deeper you get into the playoffs, the more battle-like and conflicting sort of fan bases is what kind of drives the whole intensity of the playoffs. So it definitely was a whole different animal in that regard, just because, especially that season with the swagger that the Canucks had that season, it very much felt like a Canucks versus the world sort of mentality.
Let's get into that, because it is part of our story here. It's not something that can be ignored. You look, and I think let's put this in context. The 2004 Calgary Flames had the big run after beating the Canucks in overtime. They had the run to the Stanley Cup, and there was sort of a national. It was Calgary pride, but there became a national love. You saw there was reports of flame flags in Quebec. There were flame flags in Edmonton. There was a love for this lovable 2004 Calgary Flame team. The Edmonton Oilers in 2006, they had that run, and there was sort of this feeling of getting them back to the prominence again. It was finally the rise of the Oilers, and there was sort of a national love. Ottawa, I don't know. I don't think that there was a love or a hate for Ottawa. I just think that there was Ottawa. But when it became to the 2010-2011 Vancouver Canucks, I think it's fair to say that there was not a national love for them. And we touched on it a little bit because of what happened during the season, how Vancouver was dominating Canadian teams. But there seemed to be a real us versus the world. And it wasn't, the Canucks did not have the "we're Canada's team" label behind that. From your perspective as Canuck fans, how did you feel about that? Did it bother you? Did it incite you? Where were you feeling about that?
At the time, it bothered me. It doesn't bother me anymore. Having the perspective of realizing that there was jealousy behind it, but also when you're the number one seed going into the playoffs, you're the target. I don't think that we as Canuck fans really understood that completely at the time. And so it's different. Like Calgary and Edmonton were more of the Cinderella type runs, and they had really hard-working teams that were really reflective of the cities that they played in. And that was easy for people to latch on to. And in the case of Calgary, it had been 10 years since a Canadian team had been in the Stanley Cup final. And the Canucks run in 1994, I think, was well celebrated across Canada as well because of the Cinderella nature of it. But when you are the favorite and you're expected to win, everybody's gunning for you, and inevitably there's going to be people rooting against you just because you're the target to root against.
Yeah, when you're that dominant, you're going to have people who are hating and jealous of your success. I'm not going to try and say that we are anywhere close to the level of like dynasty sort of thing. But as far as the level of hate, it reminds me a lot of the hate that the Patriots in the NFL get. There was just, unless you were a fan of the fan base, you hated the Canucks that season. At least from a Canucks fan, that's how it felt for me.
Yeah, I think there was definitely as a Canucks fan, and especially as a Canucks fan in enemy territory, it felt like there was, no one wanted to cheer for the Canucks. I think there's definitely part of it was because the success over the previous few seasons. Part of it was the swagger and confidence and cockiness that the team had, whether it was from Gillis or it was Ryan Kessler or Alex Burrows. And then you have to remember that this was a year after the Ron MacLean just character assassination of Alex Burrows on Hockey Night in Canada. So I think there's definitely some us against them. Embrace the hate was a bit of a come to arms for Canucks fans too. at that point.
I was on Twitter back then, and Embrace the Hate was definitely a hashtag that was trending in Canucks Twitter back then.
Yeah, I remember that. Let's go back to, for those who don't know what the Ron MacLean, Alex Burrows, talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was just, I think there was a game, if I remember correctly, there was a game, and just before the game in warm-up, I think, there was a Stefan Auger was the ref, and he went up to Burrows and said he wasn't going to put up, like, just basically said he's going to get him for whatever slight he thought that was there. And then Ron MacLean tried to basically make it and then Alex Burrows after the game came out and was just super emotional about it. Like, he felt like he was targeted and attacked, like, by that by Stefan Auger, and like he was not good. There was never going to be anything he could do a call he could get from that ref. So he felt just he didn't know what to do. And then Ron MacLean came out and basically defended Auger, and basically everything that Burrows said and did was wrong, and everything that Auger did was right. So Canucks fans definitely took that personally, and then that was I think that started the beginning of the go get the us versus them, and the hate that really separated the Canucks and kept them from being a quote-unquote Canada's team.
That went so far that the Canucks organization boycotted the Hockey Night in Canada broadcast either later that evening when they were playing the late game or the following week. That part of the detail I don't remember, but the Canucks actually refused to participate in the broadcast in terms of offering up players for interviews, etc. That's how serious a situation it got. Just a really poorly thought out segment by Hockey Night in Canada's producers did illustrate at the time how much influence Ron MacLean himself had on the show. Doesn't have that kind of influence now under the Rogers regime, but also showed where Ron's biases lie in hockey. And I'm a referee and pro referee and everything like that, but I mean he's on the segment putting words in the guy's mouth. He doesn't know what the conversation really is. The fact that a referee would be skating around talking with a player before a game, especially when something happened in a previous game involving that player and a referee, does make you wonder what is the purpose of the conversation. But for Ron to be sort of speculating as to what the referee was really saying was just really sloppy on the part of himself and Hockey Night. And Canucks boycotted it, and that just rallied the fans even more in the whole us against the world bit.
Yeah, because if you're going to essentially threaten a player pre-game, it doesn't really exactly exude professionalism.
Well, this is the thing. Was it a threat? Nobody really knows what the conversation was. I mean, Burrows, had his view on it, but we've never heard the referee's point of view on it. Like, just why even go there is the question, right? Like, if you're Ron MacLean, why even go there? What was the real need to do that? And I don't know. I mean, it just seemed like an extension of a bunch of things with Toronto media, where at the time the Maple Leafs were god awful. And here's the Canucks having all this success, and they just couldn't help themselves but find some story to in this case, completely fabricate, I think. But, you're getting me excited about this again, just talking about it. But it's I've just never seen anything quite that remarkable on a national hockey broadcast.
Well, and the timing of this... Oh, go ahead, Sean.
I was just saying, it was everything that Tyler said is correct. It's just... It made no sense why you had to address it like that. It made no sense to do anything other than basically have Ron try and protect a ref that made a mistake.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what was there to gain for Ron? Like, there was nothing to be gained by doing it. It was just really odd. And they had Colin Campbell sitting there with them to try and validate the whole thing too. Like, it was just really, really poorly thought out. And it's like, how can this be national television? Who the heck approved this idea?
like Tyler can disagree with me if he feels like it, but to me, it just very much reeked of Ron trying to defend Auger just on the principle of like the referee brotherhood, in the same sort of spirit that like police don't rat on the other policemen, in the same sort of same sort of principle.
Yeah, and Ron was trying to defend the merits of a referee skating around before the game, talking with the player. And for me, like I never want to have conversations when I'm refereeing before games. There's nothing to be gained from it. It's just putting stuff in the players' heads. You want to start with a clean slate every game. Yeah. I don't want to talk about previous games. That's in the past. Yeah. So much so that I believe that if a coach or player wants to bring up my performance from a previous game, I should penalize them for it. It's offside. That's not how this works. So, anyways, that's how I feel about the topic.
But that's why I said it reeked of unprofessionalism.
Yeah. Sorry,
I didn't want to interrupt.
No, I just Ron's in the wrong on that one.
And the timing of that was fascinating because that was the weekend going into Hockey Day in Canada, and CBC had to do some scrambling back then to make sure that the Canucks were on board, because that's, of course, a ratings bonanza for them as well. So, yeah, quite fascinating there. And a good context of where a lot of this... I still think we get a lot of Canucks versus the world media here, and feeling that Toronto has slighted Vancouver. Of course, having some Saturday games that had to be moved for different times for Toronto, and sort of that kind of that edge rivalry, I think, is still there for sure. Some other cultural things, we touched the Green Men. We should talk a little bit about them and the stories behind them. It's just, I remember these two weird things dancing in penalty boxes, and it was like, I don't know what to think about these weird things, but they're weird. But it also gave some sort of a very unique personality. What do you remember about the Green Men?
Just that they were polarizing. You either loved them or you hated them. I loved them, and I thought they were hilarious and great, and they added some fun to the game and all that. But other people didn't like them because they were influencing the game somehow.
Well, I was partial on the Green Men because I knew one of the Green Men. So it was fascinating from that perspective, just to see how much guts those guys had and taking their act as far as they did.
So you actually knew one of them back when their identity was still a total secret then?
Well, yeah, I mean, they weren't really keeping it that big a secret, though. That was the thing. But
well, I meant like to the general public. None of us knew that they were BCIT grads until like 3 or 4 years later.
Yeah, that's right.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, I had done some UBC football broadcasting with one of them in 2006 and 7, somewhere around that time. But it was before they became the Green Men.
Yeah, they were the kind of the Storm Surge before the Storm Surge in some ways, because it was the traditionalists were like, "My God, what is this?" Like, banning fun, and then it's people that wanted that added a little bit of a personality. Like, I'm not comparing them to the Storm Surge, but it was sort of like that bring some personality into the game. And
it's pointless fun for pointless fun.
Yeah. And the other thing, and I forgot about this, but someone brought it up, Vancouver pizza became a thing, as opposed to Boston pizza.
Yeah, that was definitely amusing, but I never thought it was actually going to like go to the national level that it did, because it got a lot of press. But obviously, Canucks fans jumped on that, because why have anything labeled Boston in the city?
Fair.
Seems a little petty to me, but in hindsight.
I think I remember lots of times when I think even now, like even this past couple playoffs, like Toronto's not they've boycotted Boston cream donuts at Tim Hortons. So Like it's not without precedent that teams, even up until this day, and fan bases up until this day, can continue to do this.
Again, it's pointless fun for the sake of pointless fun.
Yeah,
there's not really much more of a need for it than that.
Yeah, so we get to the Stanley Cup final. Before we get to the Stanley Cup final, let's quickly touch on where are we at the Sedins at this point? Are we did your perception of them change in any way during the playoff run before we got to the final?
As a Canucks fan, no.
No, they still showed who they were. They still showed. Sorry, Tyler, you can go.
I was just going to say, the third round was reassuring about their playoff capabilities, because they had a very strong third round against the Sharks, so it had me feeling very optimistic going into the finals about them being able to get it done for the Canucks.
Yeah, the third round really did reaffirm it, but they still were showing on the skill that they had, and that they were the top two of the best players in the league.
But maybe at that point, that's actually when people fully realize that these guys can actually vault their team to this late in the playoffs. So maybe that's when they started to get more national level respect. Whereas I'm not sure prior to that Stanley Cup run, I don't think they really did have any sort of national level of respect.
I don't think anything really changed, honestly. I still think they still got, and even till this day, I don't think they're people outside the market really understand how tough they are and they were and are, and how skilled in everything that they were, and because I've said this so multiple times now, it's toughness is such a weird word in hockey. So when you have two guys who aren't going to fight back and aren't going to drop the gloves, because they know that if they do, they lose their a potential power play and an ability to make a team pay. It just the old school hockey mind. The old school hockey fan loses their mind, and that's still definitely part of the culture in hockey.
Yeah, no other fan base is ever going to be able to appreciate them to the level that our fan base did. There's no qualms about that, but I do feel like they did come. They did have a little bit of a coming out party in that Cup run. I stand by that statement.
Well, Chris, like they came back. They were coming off of back-to-back Art Ross wins between Henrik the year before and Daniel that season. Like their coming out party was the regular season beforehand, and beforehand that too.
But I do see what Chris is saying in the sense, like, there was a level, as an example, I'll take Jonathan Toews at the time as an example. There was sort of a different level that they got to. Like, Jonathan, like, they felt like you could win with them. It was sort of that next franchise step. Like, as an example, a modern comparison would be Ovechkin, where he never won for a really long time, so he wasn't perceived the same as he did when he won. When he got over that mountain of beating Crosby. Fair or not?
I guess, but I think that's two completely different things, in my opinion. I think you've got someone who everyone knew how skilled they were, and I don't think there was any doubt on that. And everyone knew and knows how skilled Ovechkin is. The winning part is always such a weird sort of caveat to how people look at and portray certain players. Like, is Iginla considered a lesser player because he didn't win a cup?
Not in my mind.
Not in my mind either.
Yeah, exactly, right? So why like and that's kind of where I'm coming from. The coming out party for the Sedins was those 2 regular seasons beforehand when they absolutely dominated those 82 games.
Okay, so I'll take that point. Like, maybe I just chose the wrong words, but I feel like there was an extra level of respect that they gained after that run. Yes, people knew that they were skilled, but as far as being able to carry a team to that level, I feel like people may not have realized that the Sedins were capable of that prior to that.
Well, again, it's something completely different in my mind because, again, like is Ovechkin winning the Cup 2 years ago? That's great and it's fantastic. But does that take away from how good of a player he is? No, and it doesn't take away from the difference between what the Sedins did, but pre and post Cup run doesn't change it either. And again, I think part of this is me knowing how opposing fans still viewed them, and there was nothing really changed, especially after the finals.
Yeah, I'm not. There's a lot of outpouring for the Sedins now, and when they retired, and I got to give the Sportsnet people credit. I mean, they've gone wall to wall with thank you Sedins and covering the final days of their career, and then the coverage that we're going to see tomorrow night. So there is a high level of respect there for the Sedins that I'm not sure would have been there if not for the one run, right? Like if they never got past the second round, I'm not sure that the post-career narrative about the Sedins would be quite the same. Even though
I think Tyler kind of nails where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, we know they're great players, but the strong impressions for the lesser invested hockey fans come in the playoffs for sure.
Because we did not see this for Jarome Iginla when Jarome Iginla had his retirement. And I do think that there is a different level with the Sedins, and I do think that is because of this Cup run that we're talking about. I do see
with them. There's the uniqueness, the fact that they only played for one team. Those are they're twins. There's some different stuff to sink your teeth into there than Jarome Iginla. But the other part of this too is I think that there's, like, in my mind, probably all of us here are in agreement that the Sedins are Hall of Famers. But there's people out there that don't think so because they never won a Stanley Cup.
And just to go back to your point of like them being, you're not stereotypical like Canadian hockey guy, like the fact that they were Swedish probably plays into the fact of lack of respect in the sense of like, just because Iginla got a game away from winning the Stanley Cup, he was this folk hero because he's this Canadian kid. Whereas the fact that like the Sedins, because they're from Europe, maybe that played as a disadvantage for them as far as the lack of respect from a Canadian fan base.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an awkward conversation that probably at some point we need to have a more deeper, but I do think that there's some validity to that. The way that we've looked at Canadian players as opposed to European players in terms of how they can win, and their reputation, I think that's a fair question. I think it's a fair, valid question in 2020 that we ask about that, but that won't, we can't get into that today because, we do have to sleep at some point in time. But let's go back to the Stanley Cup final and get us ready for that as I pull up some information here. The coaches, of course, Claude Julien was the coach of the Bruins. Alain Vigneault was the coach of the Canucks. The captain, Henrik Sedin for the Canucks. Zdeno Chara for the Bruins. National anthems, which was also something quite fascinating. Rene Rancourt for Boston. And Mark Donnelly, who I thought did a fantastic job doing the national anthems from Vancouver. That he just allowing the crowd to get involved, I thought was great. Anyway, anything you wanted to add to that, or?
I feel like the fan appreciation for Mark Donnelly has changed since then, but definitely back in that era, yes, we absolutely loved Donnelly.
Yeah. All right. And the commentators in NBC was Mike Emmerich, Eddie Olczyk, and Pierre McGuire. CBC, Jim Hewson, Craig Simpson, and Glenn Healy. And Game 1 starts, and the Canucks come away with a 1-0 victory on Rafi Torres' third goal. And then Game 2 happens, and it is 3-2 overtime goal win. 11 seconds into overtime, Alex Burrows from Daniel Sedin and Alex Edler. And you're halfway there. Vancouver is halfway to the Stanley Cup. They're up 2-0 heading to Boston. How are you feeling at this point in time?
Oh, after Burrows scores that awesome wraparound goal, as a Canucks fan, you couldn't help but feel like it was our year.
Yeah, I definitely had the feeling. I remember specifically discussing with my brother and a couple of friends, like they're going to actually win the Stanley Cup. Like, if there were any doubts, they were pushed aside pretty hard after that Game 2 overtime victory.
Yeah, that win definitely gave Canucks fans almost like an air of invincibility, like a false sense of confidence after that win. I remember being just almost borderline 2010 levels of euphoria after that game.
And it also were buoyed and inspired by the return of Manny Malhotra. He returned that game after taking that severe eye injury, which I think for Canuck fans, adding Manny Malhotra was like a late playoff trade deadline acquisition, a guy that can win faceoffs. I don't know. I mean, we don't have time necessarily to get into Manny Malhotra, but one of the better faceoff players in National Hockey League history. So there we are, 2-0 heading to Boston, and then we have the second period of Game 3 where Boston scores 4, Andrew Ferrand scores, Mark Recchi scores, Brad Marchand scores, David Krejci scores. It's 4-0, 5-0 in the 5-0, and then ended up 8-1. And how were you feeling after that?
Was it shell-shocked?
Yeah, that's about right. It was shell shock. You're just like, okay, now what's going to happen? That's a game. That's a series changing game.
Was it the series changer?
Yeah, it completely took all the momentum away that the Canucks had from winning both games at home.
Well, the other thing was, Luongo getting lit up so much, kind of, all the concerns about him sort of returned all of a sudden. It's like, this is looking a lot like previous rounds against Chicago, where the other teams, best offensive players seem to have him figured out. Definitely, on one hand, it was just one loss. It was only Game 3, but still, it was an ugly loss and a big momentum swing and a big, concerning. But I wasn't in full-blown panic mode until after Game 4.
In what ended up 4-0. Rich Peverly scores twice. Michael Ryder scores. Brad Marchand scores. Roberto Luongo is pulled for Corey Schneider at this point, and the series is tied at 2. And this is also we're starting to get into the media war. This is where we started to see this Boston-Vancouver rivalry kind of get here. Did you start to feel a bit of hate for Boston at this point in time?
Oh, yeah.
Being embarrassed 2 games in a row definitely can do that to you.
Yeah.
Well, and they got a little messy. And of course, there was the Brad Marchand antics. We'll get to the peak of that in Game 6 here, but Brad Marchand was doing his thing. Zdeno Chara was doing his thing. Tim Thomas was doing his thing. That probably didn't help. The actions of the Bruins probably didn't help either.
Well, and this was starting to get to where, again, we were talking about the Canucks versus the world, right? Where the national media decided to choose Boston over the Canucks for whatever reason. Because at this point, both teams were not behaving very well. You had Brad Marchand on the Bruins. You had Mark Recchi, who was trying to become Dr. Recchi at that point. And then you had Lapierre and Burrows and Kessler on the other side, right? It just both teams were misbehaving, but for some reason the national media decided to choose Boston over the Canucks.
And looking back at it, it was probably due to the lopsided wins, but yeah.
Well, it wasn't even that though, Chris. It was just they chose the side of Boston on. It wasn't like, oh, this is when Boston's going to take over the series and they're now the favorites. It was it felt as a Canucks fan that there was some bias and favoritism towards Boston and in terms of the coverage.
Yeah, the coverage had the impression of Boston deserves to win, Vancouver doesn't.
Yeah.
And I think the lopsided wins kind of plays into that, but maybe I'm mistaken.
I think it's some of that, Chris. I also think it's, and we hear this often throughout Stanley Cup finals is, which team has more Canadian players on it. And I haven't done a tally, Vancouver versus Boston, but that was just the impression that was trying to be conveyed at the time from what I saw was that Boston was a more Canadian team than Vancouver. The star players for the Canucks were Swedish with the Twins, and an American in Ryan Kessler, and then over on the Boston side, I mean, you had Marchand and Lucic and Bergeron, and they're all Canadians.
Yeah, no, as a Canucks fan in that era, I do recall a lot of anti-Canuck friends that I had back then that they were very much pointing out that fact that basically it was Team Canada versus Team Sweden in their minds.
Yeah, and it again goes back to sort of how the Sedins reacted to any time they were pushed around. They just took the power play and tried to make the team the opposing team pay on the power play. Well, Boston would fight back and create a scrum and go do it that way, which was the old hockey way, and not the more what we see these days.
Yeah, it was certainly fast. And then Game 5 happens. Roberto Luongo makes 31 saves. He is the first goalie since 1945 to win a 1-0 shutout. Maxime Lapierre scores, and you're one win away from winning the Stanley Cup. Everything's going to be okay, right? Everything's going to be okay. And it's at this point we get the Tim Thomas-Roberto Luongo rivalry. Let's maybe talk about that rivalry. What the tire comment? What did you think of that at that time?
That was definitely the media getting to the Canucks and Luongo more than anything else, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it was also overblown too.
Well, Luongo made a very strategic error there I don't really recall him being prompted, but he had to take a shot at Tim Thomas being a little too active in his crease, got out of position, that enabled the Maxime Lapierre goal in Game 5. And Luongo just couldn't help himself. He had to bring that up in the post-game press conference. And I think he was frustrated that there was all this praise for Tim and not any praise for him. But it's just like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you giving fodder, not just for the media, but for the other team, when you just took the lead in the series and you're one win away from clinching? At the time, I thought it was a terrible strategic decision, and I stand by that still.
Yeah, it was definitely baffling.
And then one thing we haven't talked about is the Aaron Rome hit on Nathan Horton.
Yes. Okay, Let's talk about that. You're right. I forgot about that.
I'm still irked about that to this day, by the way.
Let's.
I mean, it's only the biggest turning point of the series, but...
Well, no, I mean, I don't remember that. I didn't remember that specifically. That hit, I I blanked that from my mind for some reason because I always remember a different play than the Aaron Rome hit when I think about this series in there. But let's talk about it's fair. Let's talk about the Aaron Rome hit.
The way it was handled just made no sense, and the length of suspension. There's nothing before or after has made it make any more sense to me. Like, you suspended him for the rest of the series, and I think it was game 3, was it?
Yeah. Something like that, yeah.
They suspended him for 4 games, so it was the remainder of the series.
Yeah. So it's just like it made like and when you have Burke coming on ever since then, talking about 2-to-1 ratio, like odds, or 3-to-1 like conversion of regular season to playoff and Stanley Cup final games. Like you're telling me that a split second late hit is, and it was literally split second late, was worth 8, 10, 12 games, and no, it made no sense. Like there's so many things with this series that you can't really say like this was the game, the series changer, or this, that, or the other. But
to me, the two biggest factors in the change of momentum was both that Aaron Rome hit as well as the Hamhuis injury.
So the Rome thing, I mean, to me, this relates back to when Raffi Torres crushed Brent Seabrook in the first round. There were a lot of media fuming at the time that was a hit that should have been suspended. The league didn't suspend. There was a lot of narrative around that and how the Canucks got away with it, and they're this dirty team, et cetera, et cetera. So then you fast forward to the Stanley Cup final, where there's more microscope, more media coverage. It was the first Canada versus U.S. Stanley Cup final in quite a while, so very high profile. And then that happens, and it was late, not egregiously late, but late enough to be an interference penalty. Except that then the stretcher comes onto the ice and the guy's not moving, and I mean, it's kind of an asshole comment for me to make, but I think that they milked it. Honestly, I mean, that's how I feel about it as a Canucks fan. And then they got what they wanted. They got a 4-game suspension to a key defenseman, and it had a lasting effect on the Canucks' ability to compete in that series. The other thing that stunk about it is the normal disciplinary process led by Colin Campbell had to be put aside because Colin Campbell's son was playing for the Bruins at the time. So now you have somebody else that's making the decision, supposedly, and like Sean said, just didn't make any sense. It didn't have it. There was no comparable to anything that occurred before or after. It was just sort of pulled out of the air, and I think mainly because the league buckled to media pressure.
And looking back in hindsight, the thing that still irks me the most is the fact that, what was it, like 1 or 2 games later, Nathan Horton is hyping up the crowd in TD Garden. If he had that serious of a head injury, he should not be around loud noises like that within 72 hours.
Would it be a fair thing, and this is the thing that really bothered me about that series from, observing Boston. They played very different at home than they did on the road. They did not, when they were in Vancouver, there was none of this stuff. None of this stuff happened. We'll get to Game 7, but they did not act the same way that they did at home. There was a different behavior. Like was I the only one irked by that?
No, I felt that way. I felt that the Canucks were getting, they were able to play more their game at home, and I suppose getting the matchups and last change and all that certainly helps. There's going to be forever people are going to talk about this series as one that wasn't fairly officiated. I don't fully subscribe to that. I think what we saw was what we usually see as the playoffs go on, and that is that fewer and fewer calls get made, and eventually the tougher, more manly team, the team that has a higher will to win, ends up prevailing. But it did seem like in the home games for the Canucks that the officiating was a little more favorable to their style of play. That's just kind of how it looked. But yeah, different venue, different advantages to being the home team may be a factor there.
Do you think, looking back to that, maybe but I mean, they played their game. It wasn't so much that they were trying to be that manly, tough team. Should they have taken a little bit more? Did you feel that? Sounds like a terrible thing to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think they should have been a little bit more physical on the Bruins in their own barn when they were at Rogers?
The Canucks played a physical game. They were very. If I remember them, then they actually played a lot more physical than I think a lot of people gave them credit for and give them credit for now. I don't think it was an issue in this. I think it was just more of a war of attrition at this point. You have to remember, like, they were down. Like, Bieksa was playing on, like, I think with like one shoulder. Hamius was injured. Ehrhoff and Edler were shadows of themselves. Like, they had a rookie Chris Tanev playing in the finals. It was, and they were on the verge of bringing Nolan Baumgartner back from the beach to play in Game 7.
Yeah,
like, that's how close it was for them. Like, the blue line was absolutely just decimated.
Yeah, and Kevin, a while back in this podcast, you referenced the off-season move that brought Keith Ballard to the Canucks, and it's just such a shame. I feel bad for Keith Ballard. He ended up being bought out by the Canucks. I mean, he didn't orchestrate the trade. He didn't pick the Canucks as a free agent. And the Canucks gave up a lot to get him, first-round pick. And I believe the transaction was, you mentioned it earlier, it was a first-round pick and Michael Grabner for I think it was those two for Ballard and Victor Oreskovich, if I remember right. But what you ended up having was either running Andrew Alberts or Keith Ballard out there in the final, and neither of them could get the job done. They were just torched. And I just felt bad for those guys. They're forced into a situation that they weren't up to the task to complete.
Yeah, and that's where it came down. Well, that's what that series came down to, was a war of attrition. And
yeah.
when your blue line is missing your anchor and Dan Hamius, the emotional leader is playing injured, and your two other guys are quite injured, and you still have Sammy Salo, who, as good as he was still probably playing injured at that point. Like, it just, there was only so much they could do at that point in terms of playing extra physical.
Okay, fair enough.
And which is what made the Rome suspension even more just brutal, because they were already just. Their defense was already decimated, and they got this just brutal decision that left them down another defenseman. Like, I've heard stories that Aaron Rome still can't talk about it because he felt that he let that team down, even though it wasn't his fault that they decided to make an example of him that made no sense at all.
Yeah, interest. Yeah. That's a story that I think needs to be uncovered a little bit more, what happened there. And that was a significant point. And then we get to Game 6. It is June 13th, 2011. And another key factor was, and this blends into the Aaron Rome suspension, whether you like it or not, Johnny Boychuk hits Mason Raymond. He suffers a fractured vertebrae 20 seconds into the game. How did you, looking back at that, after all the Aaron Rome controversy, how did you feel?
It was frustrating because it was a cross check to the back to a vulnerable player who couldn't defend himself. Like, I don't know the rules inside and out, but cross checking, boarding, take your pick. Like, it just felt wrong, like absolutely wrong.
And the funny thing is the first penalty in that game was an unsportsmanlike conduct to Henrik Sedin, 56 seconds into the game.
Likely because he was still fuming over the non-call of the whole Mason Raymond incident.
Yeah. But and that was also the game that Brad Marchand took the liberty. It was Henrik, wasn't it? It was
Daniel Sedin.
Was it? It was Daniel. Okay, it was 22, right? And that is, that I always, when I think of this series, it is the first thing that comes to my mind is that moment that Marchand is punching on Daniel. I don't know where to go. I don't even know what to ask at this point in time with this because it's such a frustrating. It was such a frustrating thing. There was no call on it. There was no punch back, which was a frustration. Looking back at that play, that moment, though, now, what do you remember about that, or what do you wish happened there, or?
Like, part of me doesn't want the Sedins to ever break character, which they didn't, but, like, part of you kind of feels like in this moment, especially after what has preceded it in the past couple of games, just let it go, Daniel, and just, like, maybe not get into a full-on scrap, but just do something instead of just standing there and taking 6-7 punches to the face.
Yeah, my problem with it is when they're the leaders of the team and they're allowing that kind of getting pushed around, it just sends the message to everybody that the whole team can be pushed around. I was like, do something. Yeah, I would have preferred to see a fight. They're not fighters. Okay, fine. But at least give it a go. You don't have to win the fight. Just stick up for yourself, for God's sakes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that was frustrating, but that was the mantra that they got successful on, was if the other team wants to take stupid penalties like that, do it, and then if the refs are going to swallow their whistles on that, then I don't know, because it's just because I think actually I do think Marchand got a penalty for that, but somehow they decided to give Daniel a unsportsmanlike conduct because he was looking at the ref going, are you going to call this? So it's just, there's so many layers and so many ways to go to look at it. But at that point, I was beyond frustrated and fuming about the whole situation.
You guys, I'm not sure if you remember this, but I think it was a couple of years later. I don't know if it was in the 2013 playoff series against San Jose, but it was against the Sharks, and there was Henrik Sedin standing there at the referee crease with Joe Thornton. They were discussing a call with the referee, and Joe kept poking him in the face. He did it like 3 or 4 times right in front of the referee, and like, well, why was Joe Thornton doing that? Because he could. Sedin blocked it. Refs didn't call it. So that's the one, we love the Sedins, but that is one thing I wish that they did differently in their careers. Stick up for themselves a little more often.
Did you want someone to jump in, though? Would you have taken a third man in penalty then?
Like, if the Sedins aren't going to do anything, then if anything, yes, have a third man jump in. But I think all three of us are in agreement that we actually wish that the Sedins would have done something.
Yeah, they're sticking up for teammates, but there's a lot to be said about sticking up for yourself once in a while, too.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
I saw moments over the Sedin's career where if something happened, one, the other would come in and, do a little bit of something. There was an occasion, I remember a game against Ottawa where Chris Neal was running amok and, one stood up for the other, but stand up for yourself once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
It sends a strong message to everybody else. Your teammates and the opposition.
Fair.
Yeah. And I feel like it wasn't until very late in their careers that they actually had the courage to actually actively get into scrums and maybe not fight, but at least get to almost face washing sort of level of scrum. Whereas back then they didn't even do anything.
Well, again, it was just the what they tried to do. Make them pay on the power play. Make them pay on the scoreboard. They're not fighters. Why should they go spend 2, 4, 10 minutes in the penalty box when they're they're going to be better serving their team by staying out of the box and making the team pay on the power play. That was their thought, right?
Yeah.
I think it's tough to, at this point, maybe they should have fought back or done something, but I don't doubt them. I don't blame them for the approach they took, because it got them to where they were in the playoffs and to the finals. But it always drives me nuts watching when the rule book gets changes, or just the standard changes from game 82 to game 1 of the playoffs to the Stanley Cup final. Like all I want for officiating is a standard that stays.
Yeah,
as consistently as possible.
That's the way it should be. History has shown it's not like that, and I think where the Canucks were a little naive was expecting it, to be different somehow, where it wasn't going to turn into this whole swallow the whistle thing. I mean, they should have had the foresight to understand that.
And because we're only fans, maybe we don't know the behind the scenes and how everything was running from as far as management down, but I would not be surprised if Gillis specifically told the players, no, we want them to take the stupid penalty and we want to be able to draw that penalty and get on the power play. So, it could have been something that management was telling them to do, as opposed to just the Sedins having their own style of play.
Well, the Sedins certainly talked about it in the media fairly regularly, so I don't think it was a big secret that was, kind of their strategy. But, and I don't know why it is that the rule book gets smaller all of a sudden. I mean, if you go back pre-04-05 lockout to overtime, I mean, there was no rule book in overtime. I mean, you could damn near kill someone out there and not get a penalty the way it was back in those days. And why that is, I don't know. I guess it's just a human nature of the referee not wanting to get involved.
But not wanting to get blamed for calling the game.
Yeah, you don't want to get blamed for a soft call that decides the game. I mean, we're way beyond that now. I mean, we see weird calls in the playoffs all the time now. Yeah. But it wasn't, things have changed.
All right, let's quickly get through Game 7 here. I think it's fair to call it a nervous energy because, I was living in Calgary at the time, but, watching, you saw this crowd start to fill, and downtown at at CBC, and I would feel like it was a nervous energy. Would that be accurate? Like there was a hope, but who knew?
Yeah, it was a I don't want to call it a slim hope, but we definitely had our confidence shattered at that point. So it was there was some hope there, but it wasn't like we thought we were going in and winning this game. It was more like I'm not sure how this is going to go sort of energy.
Yeah. It's 5 minutes in, about Patrice Bergeron scores from Marchand, then Marchand scores, then Bergeron scores in the second, making it 3-0, and then the empty net goal from Brad Marchand, and it was 4-0, and the Boston Bruins walked into Vancouver, and it was their only road win of the series, but it was the road win that they needed to win the Stanley Cup, and the cup is raised. And I remember this day because I was so sick. I was just brutally sitting there on the couch watching that game. And the next shot was this picture of a car on fire just outside on the street. And I just my sickness just I got better for a quick second because I just emotionally reacted and went, no fucking way is that happening. No way. Just sort of this anger. And I think we need to, We'll save Kessler for our next regular podcast because I think that that's a bigger conversation. But it's hard not to talk specifically about this without addressing the riots. We don't need to go into this for a really long time, but it is part of the story. It cannot be ignored. And my experience was that I just remember staying up all night just watching like bridges go up and down. Ray Ferrar was making reports. Robson Street was crazy. It just felt, Chris, you being there must have felt really something.
For me, it was quite surreal because, like, as you alluded, I actually was downtown to watch that game. I was at a friend's apartment. Once the game had ended and Boston was skating around with the cup, I'm like, I can't handle watching this. I'm going out to the balcony and I'm just going to try and distract myself from that. And it was when I get out to the balcony that I look over top of the apartment complex and I see black smoke. And my gut just dropped. And I was just like, no, not again. Not again. And I went, like, to say that I went into like almost like an instant depression or just like a very like dark place is putting it lightly. After the euphoria that I experienced in downtown Vancouver after the Olympics, this was the complete and polar opposite. And there's no real way I can emotionally describe it properly. I just was devastated.
I was too. I had spent quite a number of years living in Vancouver. I remember back to 1994 and how embarrassing and ugly a scene that riot was. And my feeling was there's no way that it could possibly be any worse than 94. And it actually turned out to be, in my opinion, worse than 1994. And some of that's underestimation of the situation by the Vancouver police. I think a little bit too much comfort with crowd control because of the more positive experience that was the Olympics. But I do think that the bitterness of the loss, the way that they lost, had a big impact on the riot and how quickly that got out of hand. Disappointing because even to this day, I mean, Canuck fans get mocked for that. Everybody gets lumped in with the rioting, and it's not fair, but that's what happened following a loss in the Stanley Cup final.
And maybe I just take it personally because I actually was there, but like for me, I saw that it wasn't people there in Canucks jerseys that were leading the charge to start the riots. It was people that showed up in balaclavas and bandanas and face coverings that were instigating this stuff. And yes, mob mentality definitely played a part, and there was definitely photos taken of people in Canucks merchandise doing stupid shit. But to say that Canuck fans burnt their city down because they lost is such a inaccurate misrepresentation. It actually pisses me off still to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was out watching the game with some friends, and I drove home and then just popped open my laptop and saw that what was happening. So I sat there and watched that while I was texting family members and friends to make sure they were okay. And it's what Chris said is something that I say all the time, and it doesn't excuse the people who got swept up in the mob mentality. But yeah, there was definitely some people who were there to start something if the opportunity rose, and the opportunity rose, and they were there, and they weren't necessarily Canucks fans. They were just there to cause chaos, to cause havoc, to cause a black eye on what is probably one of the best cities, most beautiful cities in Canada, if not the world. But yeah, there were Canucks fans who got swept up in it, and we have to wear that badge, unfortunately, even though we don't want to.
But I do think the one thing that does get lost in all of this, and it doesn't change anything It really doesn't, because, I mean, that's a whole other subject in and of itself. But there were a number of people that came downtown from all over Metro Vancouver to just help these businesses get board up their stuff. I mean, it's, you know, it hurts. But there was a badge of support that came out of that. It's never going to change that dark feeling of like what happened. But it creates an unfortunate and maybe unfair reputation of the city in a lot of ways. But there were people that came together, and that wasn't, I don't know if that was talked about as much as it should have been. And it's hard to do that when you're just, it's the anger of the loss and the anger of the city. It was such a heavy day when news and sports collides. It's really hard, but to reflect on that and that point. But people did come and board up places like Chapters and the Crepes and other places. And I remember, I was living in Calgary at the time, as I said, but I remember coming to Vancouver a couple weeks later. It felt different, and you could see the boards and stuff, but it certainly felt different. But, you know, I think that the support for the businesses wasn't talked about as much. Here. Yeah, so, you know, hopefully more stories on the fact that how businesses were supported at that time will be talked about more. And we'll dig into this a little bit more maybe on Saturday or the Sunday, after we record our regular hockey podcast. But I do thank Sean, Chris, and Tyler for coming on and spending a Tuesday night. Tyler, how do we follow you?
I'm on Twitter at tnoble, Tnoble.
Sean?
I'm Beardy Canucks 03 on Twitter.
And Chris?
I am at Schneids on all social media.
And, of course, Heidi is at Heidi Amazeballs. Devin is GordHow09. We will all be back together on next Sunday. We will talk a little bit more. Maybe we'll dig into the rides. I don't know. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on our next podcast talking about the legacy of Ryan Kesler, because there was a lot of conversation about that. And I think we'll see how the fans react after that game. So until then, we will talk to you all soon. Bye for now.